Why Buddha, Socrates, and Confucius appeared at the same time. In the 5th century BCE, in 4 different parts of the world, with no known contact between them, human beings independently began asking the same kinds of questions. The Buddha in northern India, Confucius in China, Socrates in Athens, the Hebrew prophets in the lands of exile. They didn't know about each other. They never exchanged a single word. And yet what they found overlaps in ways we are still trying to understand. A German philosopher thought this was so extraordinary. He called it a miracle. He gave it a name, the Axial Age. Tonight, what it was, why it matters, and what it tells you about the questions you've been asking all along. Chapter 1. The Thesis. Karl Jaspers was not a theologian. He was a psychiatrist, trained in clinical medicine, drawn to the inner life of his patients, fascinated by what it means to be a conscious human being. He spent the first half of his career diagnosing disorders of the mind. He spent the second half diagnosing civilization. He had reason to. In 1937, the Nazi government stripped him of his professorship at the University of Heidelberg. His wife, Gertrude, was Jewish. For 8 years, they lived under the shadow of deportation, a shadow that, for Gertrude, meant death. They survived the war by a margin that Jaspers never forgot. When he returned to writing in the late 1940s, his questions had changed. The clinical psychiatrist had become something else, a philosopher asking whether human beings, across all cultures and centuries, share anything deep enough to prevent what Europe had just done to itself. He was writing in 1949. Europe was in ruins. 2 world wars had demolished every confident story the West had told itself, about progress, about reason, about the inevitability of moral advancement. Jaspers looked at the wreckage and asked a question that most philosophers of his generation were too exhausted to ask. Is there any common ground left? Not Christian ground, not Western ground, human ground. Something that every civilization independently had touched. He found it in a period of history that no one had quite noticed before. In a book called The Origin and Goal of History, published that same year, Jaspers identified a window, roughly 800 to 200 BCE, with a focal point around 500 BCE, during which something unprecedented happened in 4 separate civilizations. In India, the Upanishadic sages, and then the Buddha. In China, Confucius and Laozi. In Greece, the pre-Socratic philosophers, and then Socrates. In the Near East, the Hebrew prophets, and in Persia, Zarathustra. Now, this is important. At the same time is not quite right, not literally simultaneous. The Hebrew prophet Amos was preaching in the 760s BCE. First Isaiah was active around 740 to 700 BCE. Confucius lived from 551 to 479 BCE. Modern scholars examining calendrical and textual evidence across multiple Buddhist traditions generally place the Buddha's death about a century later than traditional Theravada dating. Around 400 BCE, give or take a decade or two, which means his active teaching years fall roughly in the first half of the 5th century. Socrates was born around 470, executed in 399. The Tao Te Ching. Tradition attributes it to Laozi as a contemporary of Confucius, but modern scholarship tells a different story. Is a composite text compiled primarily in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, and Zarathustra, on linguistic grounds, probably belongs to the 2nd millennium BCE altogether, far earlier than Jaspers assumed. So we are not talking about a moment. We are talking about a band 600 years wide with a focal point around 500 BCE. In a species 300,000 years old, that is still an eye blink, but it is not the neat synchronicity Jaspers sometimes implied. These civilizations had no known contact with one another. No trade routes carried philosophy across the Himalayas to the Yellow River. No Greek merchant brought Socratic questions to the Ganges. And yet, independently, thinkers in each of these places made what Jaspers described as the same structural shift, from mythological embeddedness to reflective self-awareness, from accepting the inherited story to questioning it, from performing the ritual to asking what the ritual is for. He called this the Axial Age, the axis around which human history turns, and his summary of what happened in this period is one of the most quoted lines in the philosophy of history. Man, as we know him today, came into being, not new ideas, a new kind of thinking. Before the Axial Age, Jaspers argued, human beings lived inside their mythologies. After it, they could stand outside and examine them. Before, the question was, what do the gods require? After, the question became, what is real? What is just? What am I? And his honest admission about why it happened simultaneously. 4 civilizations, no contact, same threshold, was striking in its humility. He called the simultaneity, in his own words, in the nature of a miracle, not an explanation, a confession that he didn't have one. Now, a necessary pause. Not all historians have accepted Jaspers' thesis. Even Karen Armstrong, who built an entire book on the concept, The Great Transformation, concedes that the dates do not fully hold. The most rigorous empirical challenge came in 2018, when a team led by Daniel Mullins published a study in the American Sociological Review, drawing on the Seshat Global History Databank, one of the most extensive systematic databases of world history ever assembled. They tested Jaspers' claim quantitatively. Their finding, the traits Jaspers called axial, universalizing ethics, second-order thinking, critiques of ritual, were scattered across earlier centuries too, not uniquely clustered in the period Jaspers identified. The historian Diarmaid MacCulloch, writing about the concept, called it a baggy monster. And there is another problem, one that Jaspers himself created. He explicitly left out Egypt and Mesopotamia. He called them magnificent but unawakened, civilizations of great achievement, but, in his view, no axial breakthrough. Modern scholars like Jan Assmann have argued he was wrong. Egyptian speculative theology and Mesopotamian wisdom literature show axial-type features that Jaspers simply chose not to see. The where of the Axial Age is disputed, not just the why, so we should be honest about what we are working with. This thesis is influential. It has shaped how an entire generation of scholars, Robert Bellah, Shmuel Eisenstadt, Karen Armstrong, Johan Arneson, think about the deep structure of human civilization. It is also contested. The dates don't fully hold. The geography is debatable. The clustering may be less dramatic than Jaspers believed, but almost all acknowledge something happened in this period, something that, at minimum, is worth understanding, and that begins with the people themselves. We will start with the one this channel knows best, and then we will introduce someone this channel has never met. Chapter 2. The Figures. The Buddha you already know, not his dates, those may surprise you, but his teaching, his central insight, the architecture of his path. So we will not repeat what this channel has spent 22 videos building. Instead, we will do something different. We will place him in his world, the intellectual environment he was actually operating in. Because the Buddha did not preach in silence. He preached into a roar. Modern scholarly consensus places the Buddha's active years in the first half of the 5th century BCE, with his death around 400 BCE, roughly a century later than the traditional Theravada dating of 563 to 483. This matters. It puts him approximately contemporary with Confucius at the beginning of his career and with Socrates at the end, not separated by centuries, overlapping. The traditional dating, still widely used in Theravada countries, placed the Buddha a full lifetime before Confucius and 2 generations before Socrates. The revised dating collapses that gap. These 3 thinkers were not sequential. They were, within the tolerances of ancient chronology, contemporaries. The axial age becomes less of a metaphor and more of a fact, and the world he entered was not waiting quietly for a teacher. Northern India in the 5th century BCE was one of the most intellectually competitive environments in human history. Dozens of wandering teachers, samanas, crisscrossed the Gangetic plain, each with a different diagnosis and a different cure. The Brahmanical orthodoxy taught that the self, Atman, was eternal, identical with the cosmic principle Brahman, and that liberation meant recognizing this identity. The materialists, Ajita Kesakambal among them, taught the opposite. There is nothing beyond the body, no afterlife, no moral consequence. The Ajvikas, led by Makali Gosala, taught absolute determinism. Everything is fated, effort is useless. And the Jains, led by Mahāvīra, who was the Buddha's closest contemporary, perhaps within a decade of his age, taught that liberation required extreme asceticism to burn off accumulated karma. The Buddha rejected all of them. He rejected the eternalism of the Brahmins, the claim that there is an unchanging self, and he rejected the annihilationism of the materialists, the claim that death is the end and nothing matters. He found what he called a middle way between these positions, though not the kind of compromise the phrase might suggest. He rejected the Ajivika doctrine that effort is meaningless, and he engaged the Jains directly in the Devadaha Sutta, M.N. 101. The Buddha systematically dismantled Mahāvīra's claim that all present suffering is caused by past action, arguing that this view leads to moral paralysis. He even repurposed Jain technical vocabulary. The word asava, which in Jain usage meant the influx of karmic matter into the soul, became in the Buddha's hands the mental fermentations that cloud the mind, MN2. This is not a man who sat under a tree and invented something out of nothing. This is a man who entered the most vigorous philosophical debate of his era, tested every position available, found them all insufficient, and articulated something none of them had reached. He was not outside the axial age. He was its most rigorous participant in India, perhaps anywhere. But there was another conversation happening 5,000 kilometers to the east, and this teacher had never heard of the Buddha. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, modern Khufu, in Shandong province, eastern China. His father, a minor military officer already in his 70s, died when Confucius was a small child. His mother raised him in what later sources describe as genteel poverty, enough standing to access education, not enough wealth to guarantee anything. He became, by all accounts, the most learned man in Lu. He mastered the ancient texts, the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the ritual manuals, and he drew from them a conviction that would define his life, that the golden age of the early Zhou dynasty, and particularly the Duke of Zhou, represented a model of humane governance that could be recovered. Not nostalgia, a blueprint. Confucius believed that if a ruler would simply implement the ancient way, governing by moral example rather than by force, the state would flourish and the people would become good. He got his chance. Around the age of 50, he was appointed to a senior position in Lu. Some sources say Minister of Crime, others are less specific. What is clear is that he attempted something audacious. He tried to dismantle the fortified strongholds of the three families, the Jisun, Mengsun, and Shusun clans, who had accumulated so much power that the Duke of Lu was effectively a figurehead. Confucius understood that the names no longer matched the reality. The families who were supposed to serve the Duke were ruling him, and his entire philosophy rested on the principle that names must mean what they should mean. He failed. The three families were too entrenched. Around 498 BCE, Confucius was forced out of Lu. Not with violence, but with the quiet withdrawal of support that is, in politics, the same thing. What followed was extraordinary. For roughly 13 years, from his early 50s to his late 60s, Confucius wandered from state to state across northern China. Wade Song, Zheng, Cao, Chen, Kai, Chu. One writer called it a mobile classroom. He was not a hermit retreating from the world. He was a man carrying a political and moral vision from court to court, looking for a single ruler who would implement it. No one did. He returned to Lu in his late 60s. He spent his remaining years teaching and, according to tradition, editing the classical texts that would become the foundation of Chinese education for 2,000 years. He died in 479 BCE, roughly when the Buddha, 5,000 kilometers away, was in the middle of his teaching career, and roughly a decade before Socrates was born in Athens. Here is what Confucius taught, distilled to its essentials: Ren. The character pairs person with two. It means humaneness, benevolence, the quality that arises in the space between two human beings who treat each other as they should. Confucius considered it the supreme virtue. He almost never said that anyone had attained it. Li, ritual propriety, but far more than ceremony. Li is the texture of daily courtesy, how you greet your elder, how you enter a room, how you mourn, how you eat, the small forms through which Ren is enacted. Without Ren, Li is empty. Without Li, Ren has no shape. Junzi, the exemplary person. In older usage, this word simply meant Lord's son, an aristocrat. Confucius redefined it. A junzi is not born but cultivated. Anyone willing to pursue the way can become one. This was quietly radical in a society where moral status was assumed to follow from birth. Zhengming, the rectification of names. When asked what he would do first if given power, Confucius said, "Correct the language. A ruler who does not rule is not a ruler. A father who does not care for his children has forfeited the name. Words must be made to match reality again, because when they don't, nothing that follows from them can be trusted." And then, the silence. In the Analects, passage 11.12, a disciple named Jilu asks Confucius about serving the spirits and gods. Confucius says, "When you are not yet able to serve human beings, how could you serve the spirits?" Jilu presses further, "May I venture to ask about death?" And Confucius says, "When you do not yet understand life, how could you possibly understand death?" This silence is not ignorance. Confucius was one of the most learned men of his time. It is methodological. He chose to focus exclusively on the question of how human beings can live well together, and he treated metaphysical questions: the nature of death, the existence of gods, the structure of the cosmos. as off-topic, not denied, not affirmed, simply set aside because the human world was urgent enough. His own humility reinforced this. In passage 7.34 of the Analects, when someone compared him to a sage, Confucius declined. As for terms such as sage or wren, how could I dare accept them? Rather, tireless in pursuing it, unflagging in teaching others. That may be said of me. There is one more thing you should know about Confucius, and it has nothing to do with philosophy. His favorite disciple was a man named Yan Hui. Confucius praised him more than any other. The one student who Confucius believed had truly grasped Ren. Yan Hui died young. When the news reached Confucius, he wept openly. "Alas," he said, "heaven is destroying me. Heaven is destroying me." The grief of a teacher who has lost a student who understood him best. Did you notice something? Confucius, like the Buddha, did not write. His words were preserved by devoted disciples after his death, organized into a collection, the Analects, that, like the Buddhist suttas, is arranged by theme rather than chronology, and attributed through memory rather than manuscript. Two teachers, 5,000 kilometers apart, preserved in the same way. What they share goes deeper than that. Both insisted on inner cultivation over external performance. Both taught that an exemplary human being is defined by practice, not by birth. Both gathered communities of followers who would carry the teaching forward after the teacher's death. But the difference is the one that matters most for understanding the Axial Age. The Buddha devoted his entire teaching career to exactly the questions Confucius set aside. What is experience? What is suffering? Can it end? Where Confucius drew a methodological boundary, I will not discuss death, I will not speculate about the cosmos. The Buddha walked directly through it and spent 45 years mapping what he found on the other side. Same threshold, different doors, same century, different investigations. There were others at this threshold, and each deserves at least a name and a voice. Socrates, born around 470 BCE in Athens, executed in 399 by drinking hemlock, convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth. Like the Buddha and Confucius, he did not write. Everything we know comes through his students, above all Plato, which means we face the same question with Socrates that we face with the other axial teachers. Where does the teacher end and the disciple's interpretation begin? What we do know, he believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. In the Apology, facing his own death sentence, he said it plainly. And in the Euthyphro, he asked a question that cracked the foundations of Greek religion. Is the pious pious because the gods choose it? Or do the gods choose it because it is pious? If the first, piety, is arbitrary. If the second, there is a moral order higher than the gods. Either way, performing the sacrifice is no longer enough. You have to think, the Hebrew prophets, not one person, but a tradition, spanning from Amos in the 760s BCE through the prophets of the Babylonian exile in the 6th and 5th centuries. Amos set the tone. Standing in the midst of a thriving sacrificial cult, he delivered one of the most devastating lines in religious literature, speaking in the voice of God. I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your assemblies. Away with the noise of your songs, but let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. The same move that the Buddha, Confucius, and Socrates would each make in their own way. The external form is not the point. The inner transformation, or, for the prophets, the ethical demand, is the point. Lousy. Here we must be careful. Tradition places Laozi as an older contemporary of Confucius in the 6th century BCE. The story goes that Confucius once visited him and came away shaken. Modern scholarship tells a different story. The Tao Te Ching appears to be a composite text, compiled over time, with the oldest known fragments, the Gordian bamboo manuscripts, discovered in a tomb sealed before 300 BCE, containing roughly a third of the received text. Laozi may be less a person than a tradition. What is certain? Taoist thought emerged in this same intellectual flowering, even if the timing of its composition is later than Jaspers assumed. The Tao that cannot be named. Wu Wei, effortless action, or rather, action without forcing, another approach to the same threshold, and Zarathustra, the hardest to place. Most specialists now locate him not in the 6th or 5th century BCE, but far earlier, perhaps 1500 to 1000 BCE, based on the language of the Gathas, the oldest Zoroastrian hymns, which are linguistically close to Rigvedic Sanskrit. He cannot be presented as a strict axial contemporary, but Zoroastrianism's core innovations, the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, individual moral choice, eschatological judgment, shaped post-exilic Judaism in profound ways, and through Judaism, shaped the entire moral world that the Hebrew prophets were operating in. An indirect but real connection to the axial story, 6 traditions, 4 confirmed independent. And yet, when you put them side by side, something strange emerges. Chapter 3. Convergences and divergences. What follows is not the claim that all religions say the same thing. They don't. The Buddha and Confucius would have had a fascinating conversation, but they would not have agreed on what matters most. The Hebrew prophets and Socrates shared a willingness to challenge authority, but their reasons were different and their conclusions were worlds apart. What the Axial Age reveals is not doctrinal agreement. It is structural parallel, the same kind of move made independently for different reasons toward different ends. And the disagreements are just as important as the overlaps. We will give both their full weight. 4 things converged. The first, and the most consistent across all 4 civilizations, is the turn from external ritual to inner cultivation. The Hebrew prophet Amos, speaking in the 8th century BCE, delivered one of the most devastating critiques of organized religion in any tradition. In the voice of God, he said, I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your assemblies. Away with the noise of your songs, but let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. The sacrifice is not the point. What you do with your life is the point. The Buddha made the same move, but in an entirely different direction. In the Vatupama Sutta, MN7, he took the Brahmanical metaphor of fire sacrifice, the central ritual act of the Vedic world, and repurposed it as a metaphor for mental purification. The fire you need to tend is not on the altar. It is in your own mind. The defilements are the fuel. Awareness is the flame. Confucius said it with characteristic economy. In the Analects, passage 3.3, if a man has no ren, what is ritual to him? If a man has no ren, what is music to him? The ceremony, without the inequality, is noise. The form without the substance is a lie. And Socrates, in the Euthyphro, arrived at the same threshold by a completely different path. Not through moral outrage like Amos, not through meditative insight like the Buddha, not through social ethics like Confucius, but through relentless questioning. Is the pious pious because the gods choose it? Or do the gods choose it because it is pious? By the time the question is finished, ritual as sufficient has been demolished. You cannot simply perform the sacrifice and go home. You have to know what piety actually is. 4 traditions, no contact, the same structural move. The outer act is not enough. The second convergence is what we might call second-order thinking, the moment when the mind turns its attention back on itself. Socrates gave it its most famous formulation. In the Apology, knowing that the death sentence has already been decided, he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Not is less pleasant, not is suboptimal, is not worth living. The examined life is not a luxury. It is the minimum condition for a human existence." The Buddha developed an entire technical vocabulary for this move. In the Sabbasava Sutta, MN2, he introduced Yoniso Manasikara, wise attention, careful attention, attention that goes to the root, not just noticing what you think, but examining how you think and whether the questions you are asking are the right ones. The Buddha even specified which questions are unwise. Am I? Am I not? What am I? And which lead to liberation. Second-order thinking, refined to a degree that Socrates might have envied. Confucius expressed it through practice rather than theory. In Analects 1.4, his disciple Master Zeng describes his daily discipline. "Each day I examine myself in 3 ways. In doing things for others, have I been disloyal? In dealings with friends, have I been untrustworthy? Have I not practiced what was passed on to me?" Not grand metaphysical reflection, but the same fundamental gesture. The mind checking its own conduct every day without exception. And in the Upanishadic tradition that preceded and surrounded the Buddha, the method called neti, not this, applied second-order analysis to the deepest question of all. What is the self? Not this body, not this thought, not this feeling. A systematic dismantling of every candidate until something, or nothing, remains. The examined life, wise attention, daily self-scrutiny, not this. Different methods, the same turn inward. The third convergence is individual moral responsibility, the idea that you, not your tribe, not your ancestors, not your caste, are accountable for what you do. The Buddha stated it with a clarity that leaves no room for evasion. In the Dhammapada, verse 165, "By oneself is evil done. By oneself one is defiled. By oneself is evil avoided. By oneself one is purified. Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one can purify another." The prophet Ezekiel, writing during the Babylonian exile, made the same move within a completely different theological framework. In Ezekiel 18, he explicitly rejected the doctrine of corporate punishment, the old idea that God punishes children for the sins of their fathers. "The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, nor the father bear the iniquity of the son." A revolution within monotheism. God judges individuals, not bloodlines. Socrates embodied it. In the Crito, his friends come to his prison cell with an escape plan. He refuses, not because he thinks the sentence is just, he doesn't, but because he believes that the individual is morally accountable even to an unjust system. He chose the hemlock, and in Zarathustra's Gathas, with the dating caveat that these texts probably belong to the 2nd millennium BCE, far earlier than the other axial traditions. Each individual faces the choice between Asha, truth, and Druj, the lie. No priest can make the choice for you. No ritual can substitute for it. 4 traditions, the same insistence. Moral life is first person, no delegation. The fourth convergence is the critique of inherited answers, the willingness to say that what you received from your parents and your culture may not be true. The Buddha rejected both poles of his inherited intellectual world. He rejected the eternalism of the Brahmins, the doctrine that the self is unchanging and identical with Brahman, AMN 102, and he rejected the annihilationism of the materialists, the claim that death is the end and nothing carries forward. He repurposed Jain vocabulary, MN2, explicitly debated Mahāvīra, MN 101, and constructed a teaching that fit neither of the available categories. This was not synthesis. It was rejection and replacement. Socrates did it through demonstration. In the Apology, he described how he went to the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen of Athens, the people who were supposed to know things, and showed, one by one, that they did not know what they claimed to know, the unexamined life, the unexamined answer. The Hebrew prophets denounced a popular religion that had substituted the performance of sacrifice for the practice of justice. Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, each in different language, the same verdict: you have inherited the forms and lost the substance. And Confucius captured it in a single concept: Zhengming, the rectification of names. Names must match reality. A ruler who does not rule is not a ruler. A father who abandons his children has forfeited the name. When words stop meaning what they should mean, everything built on them collapses. Before you can fix the state, you must fix the language. 4 traditions, the same nerve. What you inherited may not be what you think it is. That is the story that gets told about the axial age, the convergent story. It is half true. Here is the other half. 4 things diverged, and if you take only the convergences, you get a comforting but dishonest picture. The divergences are where these traditions become themselves. The first divergence is the most fundamental. They were answering different questions. The Buddha asked, "Why is there suffering, and can it end?" Confucius asked, "How can human beings live well together?" The Hebrew prophets asked, "What does this God, personal, living, active in history, require of us?" Socrates asked, "What is virtue, and what can we truly know?" These are not 4 ways of saying the same thing. They are 4 different investigations. A person who devotes their life to ending suffering will build a different world than a person who devotes their life to social harmony. Both are serious. Neither is the other. The second divergence is the role of the social. And here Confucius and the Buddha stand at opposite ends. For the Buddha, liberation is in principle individual. You practice within the Sangha, the community of practitioners. But the aim is individual cessation. No one can walk the path for you. No one can awaken on your behalf. For Confucius, the human being is constituted by relationships. There is no Ren in isolation. There is no Junzi outside of family and state. The very character for Ren, person plus 2, encodes this conviction. A solitary human being is not a human being who has achieved independence. It is a human being who has lost something essential. The Hebrew prophets addressed Israel as a people. Salvation is covenantal, communal, historical. And Socrates, even when Athens sentenced him to death, insisted that the philosopher belongs to the polis. He did not flee. He drank. The third divergence is the nature of the ultimate. And here, honest speech matters more than polite convergence. The Buddha pointed to Nibbana, the unconditioned cessation, beyond categories of being and non-being. The tradition has spent 25 centuries resisting the temptation to describe it further. Confucius spoke of Tian, heaven, an impersonal moral order. but offered no theology. His silence on this point was, as we have seen, deliberate. The Hebrew prophets spoke of YHWH, a personal God who acts in history, who loves, who demands, who judges, who grieves. Not an impersonal principle, a being with a will. And Plato, Socrates' greatest student, pointed to the form of the good, eternal, impersonal, intellectual, accessible through reason alone. Nibbana, Tien, Y, H, W, H, the good. These are not four names for the same thing. They are not interchangeable. The fourth divergence is time and history, and it matters more than it might appear. The Buddha taught within the framework of cyclical samsara, beginningless rounds of birth and death. Liberation is from the cycle, not improvement within it, not a better next round. Exit. The Hebrew prophets taught that history has a direction. God is doing something in time, and time will reach a completion. History matters because God acts within it. Confucius appealed to historical precedent, the Duke of Zhou, the Golden Age, but had no strong eschatology, no claim about where history is heading. And the Greeks, Thucydides and Herodotus, invented what we now call secular history. But Plato's philosophy is largely atemporal. The forms do not change. The good does not develop. Time is the moving image of eternity, cyclical, linear, precedent-based, atemporal. Four relationships with time, four different answers to the question, does the passage of years matter? Same threshold, different explorations. If you take only the convergences, you get a comforting story about human unity. If you take only the divergences, you miss something real. Both matter, both are true. And any honest account of the axial age has to hold them together. The extraordinary fact that these traditions converged on structural moves, and the equally extraordinary fact that they arrived at genuinely different destinations, which raises the question this video has been building towards since the beginning. Why? Why at the same time? Chapter 4. Why simultaneously? No one knows. That should be said plainly before anything else. Jaspers himself did not have an answer. He called it a miracle. And while he meant the word in a secular sense, the honesty of the admission is worth preserving. The most important pattern in the intellectual history of the human species, and the man who named it could not explain it. Others have tried. The sociologist Robert Bellah proposed a cognitive explanation. He argued that what the axial age represents is the emergence of second-order thinking, the capacity to think about thinking, to reflect on reflection, to question the act of questioning itself. This capacity, Bellah suggested, was not a sudden mutation, but a threshold that human cultures cross when certain conditions align. Widespread literacy, urbanization, enough economic surplus to support a class of people who do nothing but think. The axial age, in this view, is not a miracle. It is a developmental stage, one that multiple civilizations reached at roughly the same point in their complexity curves. There is something to this, but it does not fully explain the timing. Literacy existed in Egypt and Mesopotamia 1,000 years earlier. Urbanization was not new. And the greatest axial teachers, the Buddha, Confucius, Socrates, did not write. The political philosopher Eric Voegelin and later Karen Armstrong proposed a different mechanism, the imperial window. Breakthroughs in reflective thought, they argued, tend to occur not within empires but between them, in periods of political fragmentation when no single power controls the intellectual landscape. In China, the Warring States period. In India, the competing Mahājanapadas, 16 kingdoms, no emperor. In Greece, the polis system, dozens of small, fiercely independent city-states. In Israel, the destruction of the northern kingdom and the Babylonian exile shattered old certainties and forced a rethinking of everything. There is something to this too. When no one controls the answers, more people are free to ask the questions. A third set of explanations points to material conditions. Iron Age technology enabling larger-scale warfare, trade networks connecting cities that had been isolated, the emergence of coinage and merchant classes that disrupted hereditary aristocracies. All real, all documented, none sufficient on their own. And Jaspers, a miracle. 4 theories, no consensus. No one has proven one, but there is one observation, Karen Armstrong's, that stays with me longer than the others. She noted that each of these axial breakthroughs was rooted in what she called fear and pain. Each civilization was living through unprecedented levels of organized violence. The warring states in China, the Mahājanapada conflicts in India, the Persian destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile, the endless wars of the Greek city-states, wars that Thucydides documented with such cold precision that his account still reads like a clinical diagnosis. And each of these civilizations in the midst of that violence produced teachers who said, there is something more important than surviving, and it lives inside. Armstrong called the convergence a consensus on compassion. That is partially right, but it overstates the case. Greek philosophy in particular is not primarily an ethics of compassion. It is an ethics of knowledge, virtue as excellence, and political community. Socrates did not die for compassion. He died for the examined life. The convergence is real, but it is structural, not doctrinal. What these teachers shared was not a single virtue. It was the conviction that the inner life, examined, cultivated, taken seriously, is where human freedom begins, whether that conviction emerged because of the violence surrounding it, or despite it, or in some more complex relationship with it. No one can say for certain. What we can say is that it emerged, independently, repeatedly, in the same window of history. Which brings us back to the Buddha. Close. There is a sutta, a short one easy to overlook, in the Anguttara Nikaya, passage 3.136. In it, the Buddha makes a claim that 25 centuries later, the Axial Age puts in a new light. He says, whether or not there is the arising of Tathagatas, whether or not Buddhas appear in the world, this property stands, this steadfastness of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma. All conditioned phenomena are impermanent. All conditioned phenomena are suffering. All phenomena are not self. Read that again slowly. The Buddha is not saying, I invented these truths. He is saying, I discovered them. They were there before me. They will be there after me. Whether or not anyone with the title Buddha ever appears in the world, these 3 characteristics of existence, impermanence, suffering, not self, remain the structure of reality. They are not doctrines. They are features of the territory. And anyone who looks carefully enough can find them. This is one of the most extraordinary claims in the Buddhist canon. It is not a claim of exclusivity. It is the opposite. It is a claim that the territory is humanly accessible, that the Buddha did not create a private path. He walked a path that is always there, waiting for anyone serious enough to look. The Axial Age is historical evidence for exactly this claim, not proof, evidence. Confucius found a piece of it. He saw that the human being is not defined by birth but by cultivation, that moral life begins with honest self-examination. He did not call it anicca or dukkha or anatta. He called it ren, but the structural insight that what you inherit is not enough, that you must turn inward and do the work yourself, is recognizably in the same territory. Socrates found a piece of it. He saw that almost no one knows what they claim to know, that the unexamined life is a kind of sleep, and that waking up requires the willingness to dismantle your own certainties. He did not call it yoniso, manasikara. He called it elenchus, the cross-examination. But the gesture is the same, the mind turning its light back on itself. The Hebrew prophets found a piece of it. They saw that the external performance of religion can become a substitute for the internal demand of justice, that the sacrifice without the changed heart is an abomination. They did not frame it as the move from ritual to insight. They framed it as the demand of a living God. But the structural move, outer form is not enough, is the same move the Buddha, Confucius, and Socrates each made independently. They did not find the same thing. Let that be clear. Confucius found social harmony. The Hebrew prophets found an ethical God demanding justice. Socrates found that the unexamined life is not worth living. The Buddha found suffering and its cessation. These are genuinely different discoveries. They lead to genuinely different lives. But they found something. And they found it independently in the same window of history, without contact, without transmission, without influence. And the fact that they all found it, serious human beings, looking carefully, arriving at overlapping territory by completely different routes, tells us something that the Buddha's own canon already claims. The territory is real. The questions are real. They were real in the 8th century BCE when Amos denounced the sacrifices. They were real in the 5th century when Confucius wept for Yanhui and Socrates drank the hemlock and the Buddha sat with his monks in the mango grove at Vesala. They are real tonight as you sit with this video wondering, as every axial thinker wondered, what is true, what matters, and what to do with the time you have left. Whatever the axial age was, miracle, cognitive breakthrough, response to collective trauma, it tells us something the Buddha's canon already contains. The territory is real, the questions are real, and serious human beings, looking carefully, have always found them. Whether or not Tathagatas arise,